This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
Welcome to the Holistic Survival Show with Jason Hartman. The economic storm brewing around the world is set to spill into all aspects of our lives. Are you prepared? Where are you going to turn for the critical life skills necessary to survive and prosper? The Holistic Survival Show is your family's insurance for a better life. Jason will teach you to think independently, to understand threats, and how to create the ultimate action plan. Sudden change or worst case scenario, you'll be ready. Welcome to Holistic Survival, your key resource for protecting the people, places, and profits you care about in uncertain times. Ladies and gentlemen, your host, Jason Hartman.
It is my pleasure to welcome Ivor Cummins back to the show as we discuss the elite class, their power grab, a little bit of history recap on where they've come from, why they're here, what they're doing, and most importantly, action steps that you can take and all of us can take to help preserve our freedoms and liberties. Ivor, welcome back.
Thanks so much, Jason. And we'll keep the pace fast today to get the rest of the story squished into the time.
Right. There is a lot to cover here. Everybody needs to understand there is a lot to cover. We are going to put a link in the show notes for more details on this topic and some free video content that will expand, if you want to take a deeper dive into this, that will expand on it a lot more of Ivor's presentations. So there will be a link for that in the show notes. Let's go ahead and get into it.
Okay, great stuff. Well, I'm just sharing again now. So yeah, we were at the point where we talked about, of course, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Kissinger, League of Nations, Council of Foreign Relations, and all these big, powerful organizations who are connected into the State Department and kind of CIA, and they're moving to a world government. And a big part of that we mentioned was the founding of the World Economic Forum with Klaus Schwab, who's Rockefeller's boy. But I was just stepping more to the current present because the World Economic Forum, under a different name, was created in 1971. But just jumping forward to 19, we see the trustees. So who's really the big funding trustees? And we see all the banks up the top, including Sberbank of Russia. They're still in there in spite of the current challenges. And we have the Bank for International Settlements, the central bank of central banks. So the banks are a huge part. They're bought into this whole new world government structure. And we see the usual suspects, Rockefeller, Council of Foreign Relations, and climate groups, OECD, people will be familiar with, and Carlyle, and BlackRock. So this is the groups who are really the trustees of the World Economic Forum. And here's some more personal trustees. Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission, big problem. It's basically communist system applied in the West. That's really what the EU is, and the Commission is unelected. So terrible things are happening. And we've Christine Lagarde in the European Central Bank. Again, these people who are connected to WEF, they're in position of powers everywhere. And Al Gore, that turkey, who's been 100% wrong on everything he said on climate for 40 years, but got very rich on the back of it, he's in there as well. So these kind of characters are all in there. And I'm just showing now on the screen, Larry Fink of BlackRock, of course, is a trustee, and Rubenstein of the Carlyle Group. So just very heavy hitters are all on board. And that's why World Economic Forum strategies that are, quite frankly, absurd to the ordinary person, that's why they're so successfully manifested in our world, because there's a massive amount of money and powerful influence that's sitting on the trustee board behind them. So that's why when people are confused, how is this nonsense that we see happening all over the world in lockstep? Yeah. Well, because it's very well managed. So no conspiracy theory.
Right. So absolutely.
Yeah, it's just corporate manipulation and power play at a much higher level than most of us would have been prior used to. That's all. Right. So really quickly with the story, much quicker than I usually do it. Stockholm conference, we have Morris Strong, who was Rockefeller's boy, big oil billionaire. They always are. And he's banging on about climate. And he was brought into the UN. All doors were opened. And within no time, he was head of the UN Climate Emergency effectively department. And Only One Earth, written by Barbara Ward, who was one of the founders of World Economic Forum, of course, that got very popular and talked about the earth will collapse with overpopulation and oh my God, we're all going to die. That kind
I
of
mean, this was going on 250 years ago with Malthus, and
yes.
the complete opposite happened. Again, I want to encourage
Yeah.
everybody to read that book, The Bet, which is about Ehrlich and Simon and their big debate over the decades. And look who won, right? The earth is a truly abundant place that can support a lot more people.
Yeah, and if you put our 8 billion in a 1 meter square each, I think in a small part of Texas, you'd fit all the people in the world. Now, they all need to, of course, get food and water and all the rest, but it just illustrates, people think 8 billion, oh my God, the planet is just infested with humans. But to be honest, the planet is huge and the resources are huge. So absolutely.
And not to mention that humans create resources and clean problems up and solve problems. Can you imagine all of the people that are either infants now or not yet born that will solve the world's problems in the future? Yeah, I mean, there's a reason in a corporation they call a department human resources, because humans are resources. They are natural resources. They're our best natural resource.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the Rockefellers and the head of IBM and all the Gates, they're all part of Planned Parenthood. And in fairness, they have been extremely successful with all their strategies over the last half century in the West to collapse the birth rates. Yeah. So to be honest, we're going to get the population leveling off anyway. Even if you didn't need it, it's going to happen anyway. Yep. And what you said, it's all fine. But these guys need to say it's not fine because they have not yet got world government. Therefore, there needs to be terror. And I just shown on the screen now the Club of Rome, and very quickly, they were 1970 approx. Aurelio Picci set it up. He was the head of Fiat in Italy, very rich man. They had a new book, The Limits to Growth, which basically they ran some kind of a junk Fortran program, complete nonsense like Neil Ferguson's modeling. And it showed that if the population continues, the world will collapse, right? So that became very popular too. It captured imagination. And Giovanni Agnelli funded it, but he was buddies with David Rockefeller and in Chase Manhattan Bank. And basically, it's always the same guys. So you don't need to be a conspiracy theorist to attach to this because the published history just shows you to anyone with a brain, it's always the same guys in organizations and they're always scamming because they desperately want a world government. And they've done well so far. They've done well. So really quickly, I'm just showing on the screen the first global revolution from the Club of Rome, which is a Rockefeller organ, of course. And with the red and black letters, they're actually almost laughing at us because it's fascist, communist, even in appearance.
They even have the color scheme and the typeface and that sort of flare in the background. It looks very Soviet.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah. You remember the Soviet, this huge worker with the big muscly arm and these
right. I like that fist. I like that sign. I've thought about using that in one of my logos, actually.
Absolutely. I mean, it seems to work with the masses. But they say themselves in this book, this was 91. And they actually admit themselves when they were searching for a common enemy or a hobgoblin to convince people to get behind them, they mused on that and they wrote that the threat of global warming would fit the bill. Their words. And we know what that means. It means, this would fit the bill. In other words, global warming is nonsense, but it'll fit the bill. It will work. People will believe it. And they did. And they said also in that book, the real enemy now, we declare, is humanity itself. So you can see how cleverly they turned it. They said, all you little ants, right, in the ant, you're going to be in our ant farm. But to get you there, we're telling you you're the enemy of the planet.
You know what's interesting about that? First of all, let's take the global warming issue, right? There are so many layers to that onion that need to be peeled back. The first layer is, of course, is it happening? The second layer is, what is the cause? What can we do about it? I mean, there are a lot of layers to that. But the scary thing is when they say humans are the enemy, right? It's odd that nobody in the environmental movement is recommending mass suicide. Like, why aren't these people taking their own lives? If they want to do the earth a favor, I mean, I guess the first thing they can do is just disappear and stop consuming and stop polluting, right? They just think everybody else should be gone except them. It proves what elitist they are. They are just elitist. You could argue they're genocidal dictators. I mean, that's really what they're recommending.
Yeah. Or a helpful way of looking at it is just think of cults. They are running a cult scam. And of course, the cult leader has 20 Mercedes while all the people are living in little dormitories and, basically eating next to nothing. They're running a cult. And that's why all the big influencers in climate, they go in private jets to Davos and talk about it. But yes, the ants will have to do all the work and they will preside over it as the elite overlords. And people still don't seem to see it like that.
Well, we're the useful idiots, right?
Yeah, there you are. What Carlin said, it's a big club and we ain't in it. But I think the people are waking up, and we'll get to that in the end if we move quite quickly. So I'm going to fly through these next slides. Absolutely. So then we had, after the World Problematica, the Club of Rome, we have Davos Manifesto in 73. That's the whole Davos WEF thing. And then we have Trilateral Commission, get together with Rockefeller. And their magazine, the Trilateral Commission, was Foreign Affairs. And we have Richard N. Gardner, who's a Rockefeller insider. And he did a big article. And it's basically the hard road to New World Order. So they're actually writing all this down. It's just the media are well controlled, the mass media, and they don't cover this. It's just for the insiders. And the other interesting thing is that the Rockefellers and all these elites, they love futuristic nonsense because it's a great thing to help with their narrative. Gives their narrative a bit of storyline. So Nelson Rockefeller got in and backed the World Future Society, and they did a big report, the next 25 years, a crisis and opportunity. And they have this nutbar futurist, Warren Wagner. And basically, this whole thing is about, look, crises in the coming 25 years, whether real or imagined or promoted by us, are opportunities for us to progress world government. So it always goes back to the same thing. They just want to have kind of believable crises that the commoners will believe. And then they'll say, to resolve this crisis, you need us. Like every dictator or totalitarian leadership in history. They always use the same trick. So I'm just showing that next, 1987, they renamed the European Economic Forum into the World Economic Forum because they got a lot of traction. You see an older Maurice Strong there. Remember, he's Rockefeller's boy, big oil money, billionaire in the UN now, banging on about global warming and catastrophe. And I'm just showing a newspaper front page from 1972. And Maurice Strong, the UN Environment Protection boss, right? He says we have 10 years to stop the catastrophe. Right, that's a huge headline. And
it's interesting that they keep moving the goalpost and keep pushing the timeline back. The catastrophe was supposed to be 250 years ago with Malthus. Then it was supposed to be, I'll skip a lot of time here, but it was certainly supposed to be in the 70s, right? Peak Oil, Soylent Green, the movie. Remember all these like dystopian movies and documentaries in the 70s? I mean, I do. And, it didn't happen in the 70s. Then the 80s, we had this optimistic decade under Reagan and Thatcher. That the catastrophe just never comes.
Well, but the fascinating thing is, Jason, and sadly, they're largely correct, with control of media, which by now they had a very strong control of media, they know they'll never be held to account on all the times they're proven to be liars. Oh. So they actually go ahead and keep pouring out terror, and they know they'll never be held to account. So he said 10 years to stop the catastrophe. 10 years came, 10 more years, 10 more years, 10 more years, 10 more years, and a half of another 10 years, and there's zero catastrophe. So the temperature has gone up naturally around a half a degree in the last half century, and everything's gotten better because a degree or two extra makes the world much better to live on average.
You know what? That's another interesting point I should have made earlier about the global warming scare tactics. We have to ask ourselves, really, in this order, is it happening? Number one. Number two, is it bad? I mean, think of all the non-arable areas of Earth now because it's too cold, right? Yeah. So there are benefits to global warming. I mean, I have read numerous articles on this. Numerous new species can survive and thrive in warmer climates. Crops can be grown. There are all sorts of benefits to it. And, you really have to look at this. I mean, we only hear the negative side, if it's actually happening at all. And then is it bad? And then what is the cause? And then what should be done, right? But, you have to ask, is it necessarily bad? I mean, many years ago, when there was an ice age, I'm sure there were species that did not survive when things changed and it got warmer, right? And some that thrived, you know? I mean, there are always goods and bads of everything that happens.
Yeah. Well, it's hilariously one-sided here. That's an excellent point, Jason. But the reality is the Dark Ages were a cold period. And by the way, is it happening? Well, there's always changes in the average temperature, and they're natural, overwhelmingly. So that's the first question. Second question is this bad? Well, it's only bad when it gets colder. I mean, it's that one-sided. So the Dark Ages were a cold period. It was miserable. And then you had the medieval warm period, and you had an explosion of art, and you were growing vines in England, and everything was better. And then when you got the cold period after that, a couple of hundred years later, everything got pretty grim again. And then it got warm again, and everything got better. So it's always better when it's warmer. Like, it's not even like a kind of a trade-off. It always is. And NASA published a few years ago, and they effectively had to suppress the publication. They said, you know what, whatever about the temperature changing slightly with all the CO2 we're putting back in the atmosphere, we're going from 200 parts per million, which is nothing, to 400 parts per million now, which is still tiny, because it used to be 2000 back in very beautiful periods of the Earth's history. But with this extra CO2 we're putting in, right, that's a fact, the planet is greening. There's de-desertification around the planet. So NASA made the mistake of admitting the truth that, wow, the bit of CO2 we're putting in, right, it doesn't really affect temperature because we know that, but they said, wow, it's greening the planet. Isn't this great?
Exactly. So, you know, basically what the anti-people movement is saying is that we don't want to let the plants breathe.
Yeah.
Right? You know, the more CO2 we have, the more the plants have to breathe. I mean, it's called a greenhouse gas, right? You know, this is good for the greening of the earth. It's just, these arguments are so nonsensical. It's just amazing.
They are, but unfortunately, these guys running this kind of shit show or whatever, they are smart and they know it's nonsense. Just Morris Strong, of course, and the Rockefellers, they created the concepts of global warming as a hobgoblin to get world government. So they know it's nonsense. But they also know that if you keep control of the media and you get a mass formation going, get everyone scared, you can get away with any amount of lies. And, you know, just moving on to the next slide, the next step was the UN, which is a Rockefeller organ, effectively. Rockefeller gave the buildings and land in New York to set up the UN in 1946, and they saw it as the future world government kind of infrastructure. So the UN is utterly corrupted from the start, but they had Our Common Future in 1987. And you have Morris Strong, again, big oil guy, right? Harlem Brundtland Commission, right? And she's Statoil and I think Dutch oil, trilateral commissions up to their neck in this, Club of Rome, the elites, super rich guys, climate disaster club, and you have Petro-Canada, that's Morris Strong. So big oil and big elites are 100% what's driving these global warming catastrophe big commissions. That's it. It all comes from the bad guys. It was later they funded scientists and academics to get on the wagon, but that came later. And Rockefeller specifically gave the funding for this common future on the stipulation it had to talk about climate change disaster. They did not want it talking about pollution from corporates and environmental pollution. They didn't want to go there, of course. They wanted to talk about climate change disaster.
Well, what they want to do is they want to distract everybody from the corporations that are benefiting from their pollution, and they want to blame all of us. Right?
Yes.
They want it to be our fault. So we will feel so bad about ourselves and so self-loathing that their goal is to just exterminate and just reduce the population. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. And I think their main goal is not so much mass death or mass starvation. I don't really go for those kinds of things because I haven't found the historical proof. And I always stick to the actual documented kind of proof, because if you go outside of that, you can get caught out being wrong. But I think they're going to get it because the population replacement is slowing right down.
Oh, yeah.
And they create more wars and more chaos and more trans and more LGBTQ plus 17s, XYW. All of those cultural things they're putting in means people just won't have kids. And it's happening for decades.
That's true. But, it really, you can go back to 1990, and I kind of call 1990, at least culturally, the peak of civilization, right? It's been downhill ever since then. And there was this huge movement to make people less attractive. The body positivity, the Seattle grunge movement, the hip hop and the rap music, which just was, in the 80s, the whole idea was to be a winner, to be successful, to be good looking, to be in good physical shape, to be health conscious. And then around 1990, with those things I just mentioned, it was like everybody should get fat, wear sweatpants, women shouldn't wear makeup. It was the whole idea was to make people not attracted to each other. And sure enough, it worked because, the birth rate just has plummeted and we are facing a demographic cliff. Now, it takes a long time for this to play out, but around 2050, folks, we really do start seeing some significant signs of demographic cliff, even in the 2040s. So it's a problem.
It's a problem, but we'll see very shortly. They've got loads of strategies and they all move towards the big goal. But the person in the street, it's very hard for them to see all this kind of weirdness and connect it together. So we'll do that for people. But really fast in this slide, we had Agenda 21 in 1992. And basically, long story short, Morris Strong and all the rest of the elites, they got 155 countries' leaders into Rio de Janeiro, all about the Earth Summit, and in our hands was their slogan, their hands. Yep. And they got 155 leaders to sign up to Agenda 21, which is quite horrific nonsense.
And we talked about that last time, Agenda 21. Let's corral the people into small cities so that they can be more dependent on the system and more easily controlled.
Absolutely. And it's always the same, but they use nice language. They have good script writers. So they make it sound like they're saving Granny and saving the bears, all this stuff. It's nothing to do with that, of course. And then the Earth Charter Commission in 92, you had Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands in there and Queen Beatrix, his daughter. Well, Prince Bernhard founded Bilderberg. Right. So always the same people. They had Gorbachev in, Nelson Rockefeller led it. They were bringing Stephen Rockefeller, his son, up into their ranks because they know this stuff will only be achieved after their death. They're long gamers. So they bring in their sons and new people. It's beyond their own lifetime, these visions. And we have Strong in there. And then the great transition led by Stephen Rockefeller, the new elite boy, Nelson's son, and the Earth Charter Commission, plus 15, all funded by Rockefeller, funded by Rockefeller's UN. Always the same stuff. And the next thing I switched on the slides is a reminder, the Global Leaders Initiative, Young Global Leaders, set up by World Economic Forum, started in 1993. And they realized we're going to need leaders in every country who are our property, our boys. So they started bringing in, Bill Gates was one of the first, but they had Ardern came in, our Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, Barroso, the EU Commission, Sarkozy for France, Angela Merkel. I could go on all day. They even had Leonardo DiCaprio because they saw him as a big influencer. But the long story short...
But he doesn't need to give up his 412-foot yacht, let me guess.
No, the beauty is, not only do you not have to give up anything, including jets, you are guaranteed future positions and protection. That is understood. All you have to do is achieve our vision. But they've done 4,000 of these young global leaders through the program. 4,000. I only mentioned some names. So now you see where the lockstep happens when the likes of COVID happens. Because they have 4,000 young global leaders all out there. They're all in place. So I'm going to skip the next bit, but they had an initiative in 2005, which they called the 2020 Initiative. Surprise, surprise. And they got all their global leaders and they talked to them about pandemics in the future and misinformation and how we would need to run it as future leaders. They told them what they would have to do. Yep. So when the pandemic hit, all these leaders were in place and they realized, hey, we brainstormed all this back in 2005. This is it, the pandemic, the misinformation. Right. Yep. We know what to do. So they're like Pavlov's dogs.
And they, look, they tried to get that off the ground earlier with swine flu, bird flu, mad cow. Those just never took like COVID did. COVID really worked.
Yeah. Well, they had the preparation. So I interviewed a great man, Dr. Wolfgang Wodarg, and he was the hero of swine flu because he used the EU Commission and I think the Parliament there to raise that swine flu was a nothing burger and it was a pharma scam. And they redefined kind of pandemic itself, and they took out the severity clause. So it no longer needed to be causing massive death everywhere. They said, let's change the definition of pandemic and let's just have it be a new virus that's in a few regions. And that's it, even if it's not causing any major harm. So he highlighted that around 300 news outlets around the world covered it, and the whole swine flu scam collapsed. But they learned from that, and in the following 11 years, they bought up a lot more media.
Wow.
So they learn. They're smart and they learn. So that's why COVID was so well managed, because they had all the global leaders and they now had huge donations to the main media organizations. And that's why all the media basically got lockstep too.
Yeah.
They were paid for it.
It was truly amazing how coordinated that was. I mean, I'm sure many of our listeners and viewers saw the videos of the news media, literally all these independent channels parroting the same lines, as if they sent the mass email to all of the media outlets with the script. This is the COVID script. It was just repeated ad nauseum. And then the celebrities that would, have tantrums on various talk shows about getting vaccinated and so forth. I mean, it was just truly unbelievable. One place that I found is interesting that doesn't seem to be very censored is Substack. Of course, X and Twitter, but there's all kinds of deep, documented, footnoted research on Substack about effects of the vax, and there's the died suddenly feed and so forth on Twitter and X and elsewhere, with deep academic research about the harms and the injuries caused by this. So it's it's all coming out now, and of course the hearings with Dr. F. I won't even say his name because the algorithm will pick it right up and censor me. But yeah.
I know it's in fairness, Musk's X pretty much free as far as I can see. I don't really see any problem with that now in Substack, but even LinkedIn and some of the others, they were horrific. I was knocked off for a year and a half and I didn't even breach their rules.
Yeah.
I mean, I did a funny 1-minute video showing clips of Tony Blair, and I kind of poked fun at him about his obsession with passports. That was it. That got me off LinkedIn for a year and a half. And it technically wasn't even making any claim on medical safety. It was just, taking a shot at Tony Blair. But someone picked up, the golden phone, and I was kicked off.
Right.
And that's how these guys work. They've got their channels. So fair enough. But if we go on to the next slide, 2006, we had the Global Risks Report from RAND Corporation, right? A military industrial complex corporation working with WEF. And they're going on about risks in 2020 onwards. And they're going on and on about flus. And they highlight the big risk. Apparently, this is 2006, will be misinformation. That, people will be talking misinformation and they'll make everyone panic even more. But I mean, they knew. They meant misinformation was people putting up their hand and saying, hold on a minute, this thing smells. And that will cause less panic because people will call it and say, hey, it's only a flu, guys. Yeah. But that's what they predicted would be a problem for them. They were the ones who they knew were going to massively exaggerate the effect and cause panic.
They saw that coming. God forbid people should talk, And I'll tell you something else. I'll just call it, 1/6, what happened here in the U.S., 1/6, the month and the date, okay? That's when everybody, at least everybody who has a brain, saw this massive mind control effort and what Orwell called, but how they basically just not revise history, obviously, but, put it into this black hole, right?
Oh, memory hole.
The memory hole. Thank you. For some reason, I couldn't think of that. Interestingly, do you know what came out, how bad this thought control, this mind control effort is? Literally, if you have documents, your own documents that you think are not being viewed on Google Drive or in Dropbox, those documents are now being read by their machines and censored. People have directly told me about disappearing documents from their Dropbox. I mean, that's just shocking because God forbid they would want you to be able to create evidence in Dropbox or Google Drive, share that link with people, and then people could be informed. You couldn't do it on Facebook or any social media platform, but there are other ways to share it. What are they going to do next? Go to all the printers in the world and say you can't print certain documents? I mean, it's just scary. This is what I said after 1/6. I said, this is the biggest problem facing humanity, is this revision of history.
Yeah, it is nuts. But I noticed in 2020, Dropbox I was using Dropbox, and a few documents disappeared.
Oh, that happened to you? That
It
actually
happened
happened
to
to you
me.
too.
And I remember thinking,
Now I know another person it happened to.
yeah, but I think on one of them, I got a little note where they
Yep.
actually seemed to acknowledge it, but then I never got an acknowledgement. They said, oh, this is
Yeah.
inappropriate or something. But I think they stopped that warning and they
Oh,
began
and
to do it invisibly.
yeah, they don't
Probably
even tell you anymore. They just secretly
Yes,
delete things. And who knows if that sharing link would even work, right? Maybe that's the way they deplatform you, is they
that-
essentially you're being ghosted, right? If the
that's
link won't work. And I'll give you
exactly.
another example of that. Vimeo. What a disgusting company Vimeo is. We use Vimeo just to share files in the background, not with the public usually, right? It's rarely with the public. Just in my own production process with my editors and so forth, we use Vimeo. And a video that they considered not fitting the narrative, multiple times Vimeo has sent me a notice, this video is going to be taken down. You can't
Yeah,
even post it for yourself to store it there.
I know.
I mean, this is absolutely shocking. And that Apple, another disgusting company, they have a patent on a feature that they can turn on at any time on all iPhones that can shut off their ability to record video. So if you want to record a video of, say, the police doing something bad, they can shut off your video camera remotely. They did this in China, in Hong Kong with the protests there, where people could not use AirDrop because AirDrop, since it's peer-to-peer on the iPhone, was the only way for them to get around the CCP's censorship, where they could share files and share photos and share videos with one another via AirDrop. And Apple, is a pawn for the CCP. So they shut that feature off. Can you imagine the number of people who literally died, who got killed by the CCP or imprisoned because of Apple not allowing people to use AirDrop? They turned the feature off. I mean, these companies are just pure evil. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and it's very hard for the average person to even know any of what we're saying because the censorship also works to stop people being aware that there is censorship.
Yeah.
And they know
Absolutely.
this. They know this. Well, I was using WeTransfer, which
Yep.
are a very independent company, and I don't think they ever interfered. But Dropbox was one of the first and the worst where I noticed this.
Right.
And Google Drive, I'd expect it. But
Yep.
Dropbox, I thought, was a bit more independent company. But no, they were shocking. They were terrible.
Yeah.
They were
And think of the way this is controlled, right? If you want to receive venture capital, if you want to go public, if you want to grow your tech company, if you want to get an angel group to invest in your company, they're all just controlled by the woke mob. It's unbelievable. It's amazing how successful these campaigns have been amongst the elites. It's really unbelievable.
Well, the beauty of it is that Larry Fink, of course, was ruthlessly imposing not only ESG, so you only get money if you avoid coal and real fuel, and you get money if you make silly windmills and solar things. Not only was he doing that, but he was ramming DEI down their throat, diversity, equality, inclusion, which is part of their strategy too.
Sure.
To emasculate society. But of course, Larry Fink is a top trustee of the WEF. I mean, you don't need to go far to join the dots here.
Right.
They are using that to fully transform all of the so-called free market capitalism into an utterly bound in chains system that can no longer do the right thing. All the companies are in chains because of access to capital.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's a tough
capital,
one.
not just capital, but advertising, of course, public relations. They'll be blackballed if they do something that's outside of the narrative,
Well, that's it. But the next just goes from that Rand Global Risks to the Global Brains Trust. They took advantage of the great financial crash, and the World Economic Forum jumped in immediately, made a global council, 70 global councils with 1,500 global experts to reset our whole international system of governance. So they jumped on a crisis yet again. They even had, Putin in there. That was back when things were less problematic with him.
Yeah.
But Kissinger in 2009...
He used to be in the club.
Well, interestingly, I interviewed Alex Traynor on the whole Putin, Russia and the West, but the West hates Russia, the top guys, and they want to strip mine it for its resources, and they want to take it out as a competitor. But Putin and Russia tried to join the UN and tried to stay friendly because they were worried about the power of these Western elites. And they tried, but they were not let join, of course, because they had to be the enemy in the future. They were the new Cold War enemy. So they never got to get in. They kind of got into WEF and they got to shake hands with Klaus. But at the end of the day, the Western lot know that these guys, we want to get rid of the Russians and we want to take all their minerals, resources. We want to make a mess of them like we did with all the other countries.
I want to just recommend one more book. I interviewed the author of a book. I believe he was with the New York Times. I mean, he's really left-leaning, okay? But it's interesting. He wrote a book called Davos Man. Peter Goodman, he's been on my show.
Oh, Krugman.
And we did 2 shows with Peter Goodman, the author of Davos Man, and he just shows the incredible hypocrisy going on. It was a really interesting interview. And even some people on the other side of the aisle are really awake to this stuff.
Yeah, there's positive signs that there's a lot of kind of so-called left-wing liberals that are now being called right-wing, libertarians, because they're beginning to realize, hold on a minute, I was in love with an idea that I thought was a nice idea. Now I see it hijacked and it's heading into totalitarianism. I'm out, which is great to see.
Right,
but
it is good. Yeah,
it's good to see. It's positive. And Kissinger in the New York Times 2009 writes a big piece, and we're accused of conspiracy theory, or we get a YouTube demonetized if we say New World Order, because officially YouTube puts on a warning that Wikipedia says New World Order is a conspiracy theory. But Kissinger in 2009 wrote an article in the New York Times, a big one, and the title was The Chance for a New World Order. And he says all this stuff, right? But they call it a conspiracy theory. And he's banging on.
George Bush Sr. said it a long time ago.
Yeah.
I mean, around 1990, he talked about the New World Order. So this is not a secret, folks.
Well, the beauty is that the first mention I know of is in 1956, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, who started the whole thing, working with the State Department, CIA, etc. And they said the phrase, we need to create a new world order in all its aspects, spiritual, financial, governmental, etc. They said it first. It's right. Real. But Kissinger in the Times is hilarious because he's banging on about common fears that are global. Jihadist terrorism. Remember, they got a lot of ground with that one. They got the Patriot Act.
Oh,
they got
sure.
a lot of nasty laws in on the back of the fear of jihadists.
I cannot believe how difficult banking has become since 9/11. It's insane. Absolutely, banking is now a nightmare. It's like a whole nother job. I always thought of banks as being just the infrastructure. It's in the background. I don't think about my banking for my businesses. Now I spend monumental amounts of time on banking. What should just be infrastructure in the background, right? So I can focus on business. But yeah,
banking, unfortunately, there are some who would argue that above Rockefeller and above who we define as the kingpins, because we need to pick some strata that's published. We got to be careful talking about Rothschilds and Wagners and big banking families. But a lot would say that the central banking system is actually at the higher level.
Sure.
The huge banking families. But we can't prove it. So, but banking.
But again, my statement isn't about the central bankers and the Rothschilds and so forth that probably have a net worth over $200 trillion. Some say. I mean, just they're so rich, it's insane, that family. But it's really just about the 9/11, the Patriot Act, the KYC. That's like a much lower level issue. But I just wanted to make that clear. Yeah. But
you're right. That's
certainly we can talk about the Federal Reserve and all the central banks of the world
and the Fed.
That's another discussion.
Well, true, but no, you're absolutely right. And all of that difficulty for ordinary people that they create takes power from ordinary people. It ties them up in knots. Yeah. And the big boys, they have none of that problem. They just pick up the phone and everything is done. Right. So it's another way of subjugating the people. But you have the G20 came out of the G9. Most leaders of G20 are prior young global leaders. So you can see how this works. They're creating the structures. And they set up a World Economic Forum grassroots network. So they actually were clever. And they said, hey, all these internet influencers might be telling the truth if we run a pandemic. So they got in 14,000 members, 480 hubs in 150 countries, under the age of 30 big internet influencers. And you could only get into the World Economic Forum influencers group if you were introduced by another influencer or you were a member already. So very careful not to have any moles. But the global shapers community, huge. And that's why when COVID blew, all these big influencers were screaming about saving Granny and hiding under the bed. Because they've been worked on for over 10 years. Not rocket science.
Yep.
Loads of money. And we'll skip Rockefeller lockstep 2010, but they published everything in the scenario in 2010, a carbon copy of what happened in 2020 when this nonsense flu hit. They wrote it all. Authoritarian governments would have to smash down. People would have to be locked down. They would accept it because of the fear that they had for the pandemic. They were correct. And they wrote it all down in 2010. Still on the web. You still download it and read it. Carbon copy of 2020, what happened. So these guys are well planned, you know? And I think we're wrapping up with the story. I don't know if we have time to get to the positive, but it ends with public-private partnership. Klaus Schwab came out with a big publication, 2015. The time has come for a new stakeholder paradigm of international governance. And what he's selling is, of course, fascism, because he's selling the merger of corporate and state power, which is, as Mussolini defined it correctly, fascism. So he's selling fascism. We have UN Global Goals, the Fourth Industrial Revolution book from Schwab in 16, going on about altering the human and space surveillance technology. Always the same stuff. And then in 19, the WF and the UN sign a partnership. Biggest thing that happened in the last 100 years. No media covered it. But the WF is going to use all their corporate funders to fund the 2030 goals. And that's when we had the pandemic then, right on cue, censorship, and all of this 2030 nonsense, right? Climate change, trans, gender, right? Education, health, pandemics, vaccine passports, digital IDs, all the stuff they want for the nice little ant farm. So that's kind of the end.
By the way, you've got Russo there, and he passed away, but a friend of mine, he was his uncle. So I heard some inside stories about Russo, and that was really interesting. Okay, are you ready now to switch gears and take us to the action steps, Ivor? People might be feeling hopeless and helpless here. What do we do about this? How do we fight that?
Well, very final thing is Event 201 in October 2019, World Economic Forum, Bill and Melinda do a huge simulation of, guess what? A future coronavirus pandemic. And that was October 19th. So that's just a funny thing because they knew it had come out in the summer of 19 in China, and they knew they were going to scam this in 2020. But yeah, let's get on. Now, we might skip the root cause diagram of all their strategies because, I go to the very end to speed things up. I won't work through it, and I won't go through the cartoons. I will show, though, for people watching, here's Carstens, the head of the Bank of International Settlement.
When I had an interview with Catherine Austin Fitts on the show again recently, we played his videos. So that was interesting when we shared the stage at that conference recently. I know who this guy is. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
what did he say? Tell the audience what he said.
He basically said, and it's hard to do the accent, but he said, right now, we do not know if 10 peso is spent or $100. We do not see that transaction. But with CBDC, we will see every peso, every dollar, exactly as it is transacted. We can see every transaction. And he said, we also have the technology to intervene on any transaction. At the moment it's being transacted, we have that technology. So for them, the excitement at the C in CBDC, central, they have control. So when your card is declined, you won't even know who to complain to.
And so what he's talking about, folks, is central bank digital currencies, the digital currency controlled by the central bank. And, the thought is, probably very realistically, that it will become attached to some kind of social scoring system. And if there are lockdowns for climate or lockdowns for another pandemic or whatever, they could control what time of day you can spend. If you post something on social media, maybe you can't spend on your internet access, so you lose internet access. Maybe you lose the ability to spend your central bank digital currency on cellular phone bills, so you'll lose that access. I mean, this is so scary. When I interviewed G. Edward Griffin again recently, the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, I asked him that question. I said, what do we do about this? And he said, Jason, it cannot happen. We cannot let this happen because this will literally be checkmate. He didn't say checkmate. That's my word, because I used to say that 25 years ago when the fear then was a global fiat currency, non-digital, right? But with digital capability, it would be so much more powerful for them and so much more oppressive for us.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I don't like to be negative when I'm talking to the people, but if they get CBDC, we're in such serious trouble that even I don't know if we can we can have a lot of hope. It is that serious. It's more serious than anything else that was done or will be done, including wars in the next few years. CBDC is an end game type phenomenon that we cannot let happen. And
it's checkmate.
It kind of is, because at the moment, Nigel Farage in the UK and anyone who they don't like, they can suddenly get debanked. But you can go to your bank, and yes, they won't explain exactly why, but you can go to your bank. But with CBDC, some bureaucrats in a room somewhere on the planet will decide your transaction's not going to work.
Wow.
Who do you even go to?
Yeah.
I mean, what do? Ring the central bank helpline?
Right.
Good luck with that. Yeah. It'll take you months to even find out why your card's not working.
It's hard enough dealing with your own bank or credit card company. Can you imagine this? Yeah.
Absolutely. So super fast to get to the more positive thing. I just have this diagram and the link you mentioned, they can see it all being gone through. But essentially, COVID-19 program, I call it, because it was a program. It was not really a disease. It was a program. Gender and all this trans nonsense, climate and CO2 we touched on, financial CBDC we touched on, education and the Marxist takeover of the universities the last few decades, and mass migration we're seeing all over Europe and, of course, in America with Biden, and anti-meat propaganda and the war on farmers that started in earnest, particularly in Europe. All of these things are all parallel synergistic strategies. They all weaken society, which is the main goal, and they all deliver other things towards the globalist world government. And it just puts on one page all these strategies that seem to an uneducated person to be all too different to be all part of one thing. But they are. It's classic corporate, multi-stranded, strategic program management. And when you see it all on the sheet, you can see it for what it is. That's pretty much the super fast version. Right. And war. Unfortunately, we're going to be dealing with even more war than we've seen the last couple of years, because the State Department, CIA, and the global elite need a lot of war to progress their goals and to distract the people. It's just a reality, and create more inflation and maybe
more inflation that is the liar and the thief and the pickpocket that is stealing the wealth of most people, especially the poor and the lower and the middle class. It's hollowing the middle class out. Yes. That's what inflation does. If you're in the upper middle or the elite class, you own real estate. You own it with long-term mortgage debt that gets debased by inflation. So you're moving ahead while all the others are falling behind.
They're literally, they are sucking us dry and pouring the money into their nefarious, goals. It's quite disgusting. But most people don't understand inflation. And they actually blame Putin for the inflation that they had created 2 years before.
They created it long before that. That's starting in 1971, starting in 1913 with the Federal Reserve, I'll say.
Absolutely. And that's a big story that people, of course, should certainly look up and understand. But as you say, the Jekyll Island book and that gentleman, excellent place to start on understanding this. So they do all this with nonsense narratives. And the funny thing is, Stalin used the motherland narrative to get the people with him, even though he's a totalitarian. But it was a real narrative about the Russians' love of the motherland. And Adolf used the fatherland and the kind of under the surface racism that was in Germany. He used real phenomena to get the people with him. The irony is that the latest totalitarians we've discussed, for the modern population, it seems that the narratives they best can deploy are nonsense. So all the narratives, from the bad cold that supposedly was the bubonic plague, the trans sex inversion nonsense, right? The CO2 and global warming science, we won't get into detail. It's so laughable when I looked into it and interviewed some professors. It's comical. And I could go on. They actually use nonsense to fool the people. So people should think about that and feel very offended that the narratives today to bring in totalitarianism are actually nonsense. That's what works for them. So it's something to think about. Counter narratives are everything. There's a lot of positive things happening. I mean, Jim Ferguson here on the screen, he shared that Pierre Poilievre, I'm not sure if I pronounced that, Conservative Party leader, not only are they not censoring talk of WEF now, he came out publicly and said no members of parliament will he allow to be a member of the WEF, and there will be no mandatory digital ID, no CBDC. So however committed they are, I'm not sure, but they are now publicly saying we are not going to do this. And I think that's a big deal, because they used to censor even talking about it. And we had Japan rising against the WHO pandemic treaty. And Japanese are not big protesters, but they had thousands of people out. We had a senior Japanese member of government who's come out, said he's injured by the V, right? And Japan, quiet Japan, is pushing back in a big way. We had the Road to Geneva big rally on June the 1st there. And a lot of heavy hitters went to Geneva and protested. And the police tried to corral them and stop their buses. But, there's a huge amount going on. And I think, and finally, the Heart Group, the Health Freedom Defence Fund, Australians for Science and Freedom, Rational Ground, Pandata in South Africa. So many organizations working now that were not there 2 years ago or 3 years ago during COVID. Now we have tons of great organizations producing material, and we need to support them to help us in the long run, I think.
Okay, so supporting these organizations, any advice on supporting them? Where can we just find them, look them up, donate to them, attend their events and so forth? Is that the message?
I would say, yeah, any and all of that. I mean, in Istanbul tomorrow, I realize I meant to bring a list of all the organizations. I'm going to have to go digging. It's late in the day. But I showed some there. The RFK Jr., I think, the Heart Group in the UK, Australians for Science and Freedom. So I don't have a ready-to-hand resource, though maybe when you're publishing this, I will have a link to what I put together of all of them, and pick your favorites, watch their videos, get to know them a little, pick the ones you think are being most effective, and yes, support their subscription, support their events. So many ways, because you need to get the message out as an individual, but it can be hard and your reach can be limited. So one good way is to support an organization that has more clout and more reach. And we even saw, just showing on the screen now, in Florida just the other day, in Lee County, the Republican Assembly passed a resolution calling the UN, the WHO, and the WEF terrorist organizations.
I saw that. I thought that was fantastic.
And I mean, what was brilliant for me was, now, it's not going to be let go to the very end and get ratified, because there'll be a panic and phone calls will be made. It'll be stopped. But the fact that they have clearly and accurately identified the problem, the source of our evil in the world, UN, WHO, WEF, that's it. So they know, which is fantastic. A couple of years ago in COVID, no one knew anything about these.
Yeah. And, I think it's fair to say on balance, though, these organizations aren't entirely bad. It's just that they're being used, and certain people in those organizations have taken control, and now they're doing bad things. I mean, maybe you can liken it to this idea. It seems like every person we support, as a government leader like Saddam or Osama, or whatever, right? You let a couple decades go by and they become our enemy. Right. Yeah. So, that's kind of what happens. These things, they're dynamic, they're moving targets. Right. So saying they're all bad or all good, you can never do that. Right. They do some good things, and that gives them the window dressing. Right.
Yeah. And it's a fair point. And as you grow an organization, you cannot grow it as totally evil, because it won't work.
Yeah. So it'll never be able to grow. Right. I mean,
exactly.
Even look at like the Nazis or any dictator that's come to power. Right. They all came to power under the guise of a good message of some sort.
Of course.
Right? Yeah.
But the key thing is, Rockefeller is the origin of UN, WHO, and WEF. Clearly, we've gone through that, and people of that ilk. So they grow an organization that talks nice, but when the time comes, you make sure that the leadership is in your pocket, and then they begin to clench their iron fist. So like Tedros and WHO, you get the guy in who will use that organization and run it with an iron fist. And he effectively has full veto in the WHO. You put in your Tedros, he can overrule the full council, scientific council, on whether an issue is an international issue of major concern.
One person should not have that much power.
But it's by design. The WHO was designed with absolute immunity from any prosecution for its members. And the UN and WHO, I'm almost 100% certain, no European police force can enter any of their grounds or buildings in a criminal investigation. Their initial charter carefully put in that they have full immunity and protection. And you ask, why did they do that? Because they knew someday it was going to get pretty hot.
They view themselves like an embassy. I mean, that's just insane.
Crazy.
Yeah. Okay, so let's wrap it up. I mean, we could go longer on this, but let's just bring it to a fine point, though. So action steps, any recap on that, or anything else you want to say?
Yeah, I had a list here actually, which I didn't put in my talk the other day. But basically, yeah, create and propagate counter narratives against this nonsense. And the good thing is, for anyone scientific or data centric, because they use nonsense that's easily debunked, it does make our job easier in principle. The problem is we're censored, but they are easy to debunk because they're using nonsense. But supporting the various freedom groups is probably better for the ordinary person because the freedom groups like Heart in England are producing all the scientific reports referenced that debunk the nonsense. And they can do it much better than an individual. So, like we said, and then live the counter narrative. Now, this is not going to change the world, just you living the counter narrative, but it's important if more and more people do it. Buy local, locally produced as much as possible. Support local food producers and farmers as the bad guys are attacking them. Support them. Use cash as often as you can. Keep cash alive and in circulation, make it very hard for them to try and take it out, and prepare contingencies. In fairness, physical gold for some of your wealth in your own possession, a large stock, who knows, with the wars coming down the track in the next few years, a large stock of tin goods that are good for 4 or 5 years, unrefrigerated, no harm doing it. And, use FIFO, first in, first out. So eat the stuff constantly from the front end and replenish. So don't just all leave it there for years and then throw it out if there's no disaster. Use it as a buffer of long-term stored food, just in case. Same with water. Network like hell, that's huge. In spite of censorship, make real-world networks, get with people who understand what's going on, join forces, network.
Have a community. And, this is going to air on my Holistic Survival show, but some of my other shows as well. And, what I realized after doing over 250 interviews of preppers and so forth is that this stuff can become kind of a sickness where people make it a lifestyle. And all I say is this: prepping is responsible. It's an item on your to-do list. You get it done. You cycle the food, first in, first out, FIFO, right? But here's the thing. The area I noticed all these preppers miss is communication. When you talk about building a community, your cell phone can be monitored and censored and will not work in a natural disaster, very likely. Yeah. So I recommend everybody get themselves two-way family radio systems. They're very cheap. And then also get a ham radio, but do not get a license. And do not use it because you can't legally use it without a license in the US. I don't know what the worldwide laws are, but you are legally allowed to use it in case of emergency, even without a license. And the reason I say don't get a license is because when you get a ham radio license, you give the government a preemptive search warrant to come and inspect your equipment anytime they want.
Ooh.
And you do not want to give a preemptive search warrant. Okay. That's why you should not get a license. I was, going to get my ham radio license and I decided not to because of that. I have a ham radio. I do not use it, but in case of emergency, I will use it and I can legally do that.
Yeah, that's great advice. And yeah, my brother actually has a license, but from way before any of this, 25 years ago. So he happens to have one. But if I got one, and at some point I probably will, that's good advice. There's no need for a license. And he can show me all the ropes and just leave it there for when there's a real problem, in which case you're legally allowed to use it anyway.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, excellent. And you're absolutely right. You don't want to get into this living like a prepper. I mean, right. I'm all over the world at conferences. I'm working 7 days a week. I'm completely in the real world. I'm a hardcore engineer, practical, stoical type person. I'm nothing like a prepper. Right. But yeah, I'm dollar cost averaging into buying these foods because it's common sense. I mean, it's so easy to do.
It's an inflation hedge too.
It also, and you know what? The Deputy Prime Minister in the UK a week or two ago, actually in a major newspapers, came out and told people because of a risk of war with Russia, they should be stocking up, I don't know, a week's food and water.
Yeah.
So he's told the ant people. And I heard from good authority that NATO advised the government people should be thinking of months of food in Europe and water.
Yeah.
And the government in England apparently said, we can't say that. So they came out and said 3 days or 6 days.
Right.
So even they're lying to the people because technically the word to them was you'd want months, but they won't say it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So look, in your prepping plans, remember the threes, okay? You can survive without oxygen for 3 minutes. You can survive without water for 3 days. You can survive without food for 3 weeks. Once you get past 3 weeks, everybody else is going to be gone who didn't prep, okay? So you're going to have the world's resources at your disposal at that point. So really, that's the way you do it. And
just one other kind of sinister or somber note, as it happens, since I was 17, when I got my first guns, I went shooting my whole life. I know it's common in America, not so much in Ireland, right. But the reality is, if there's a major problem, let's be honest, it won't be the army you're worried about. They'll be busy. If you're tucked in some corner of the country and you have plenty of supplies, you'll have to worry about marauders who are in the difficult position of not having enough food. And in those extreme circumstances, I just suggest it'd be no harm having the ability to defend yourself, shall we say.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. So network like crazy, get political. Anything else you want to wrap up with on this?
Well, just to get political, I think I shunned politics for 20 years. I don't even look at news updates on politicians because they disgust me. In the last 20, 30 years, there were statesmen and stateswomen 30, 40, 50 years ago. That was different. Right. But the current crop are junk. Clearly, self-interested junk. But the reality is now that all the political positions, particularly in Ireland, and I guess all over, do have power in those political roles. And they are infested with puppeticians and WEF kind of puppets, meat puppets. So we do, as a society, need to begin to just take on getting some real decent people into this quagmire that is politics, because otherwise we let them have the conch. And that's happening in Ireland. I won't get into detail, we're over time, but we have independent Ireland groups set up. I've worked with them over the last few years, and we're getting more and more candidates going for actual positions. And the time is now to do that. There is no avoiding it, because I think my last slide was Plato said, the price good men pay for indifference to politics and public affairs is to be ruled by evil men. And that's exactly where we are.
People get the government they deserve. And that's, that's good or bad. Take it for what it's worth. Ivor, thank you for joining us today. Go ahead and give out a website or whatever you like.
Oh, we'll be really quick, Jason. Just search engine Ivor Cummins and you'll hit my YouTube, my main outlet, and my Twitter @FatEmperor handle. I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn too, but to be honest, YouTube and Twitter are the main places I play.
As long as YouTube will allow you to be there.
I'm self-censoring. I have bleeps in my videos now, but it's getting pretty tough, all right.
Yeah, it sure is. All right, Ivor. Ivor Cummins, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Jason. Next time. Bye now.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.